welcome back to another episode of Legends and Lessons. We are here with Dr. Josef Harvey, and happy to have you here. And
appreciate that.
And yeah, I would love to hear a little bit about yourself. If you could give us just a little bit of background on who you are,
Yeah, sure.
so the audience can get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, so I'm a foot and ankle doctor. I live in Grapevine, Texas. I've been practicing for about 8 years. I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania. Studied engineering in college for my undergraduate pursuits, and then went and did a 2-year mission for my church. I'm a Latter-day Saint. And while I was down there, decided for a career change. My family had relocated to the Dallas area like a lot of people. And when I got back, I got a master's in biology to fulfill my prerequisites, and looked around for what kind of medicine I wanted to go into, because, you decide you want to be a doctor. It's like saying, well, I want to be a scientist. Well, the next question, is what kind? And during that time, I ended up joining a Masonic lodge in Rockwall, Texas, and one of the Mason doctors there said, "Hey, man, have you ever heard about podiatry, foot doctor?" And I'm like, "No, I think I saw something on Seinfeld." He said, "Hey, you ought to shadow one of my buddies," and he introduced me to a guy who was a foot doctor. I shadowed him for a while. Was like, "Man, this is pretty interesting work. This guy's got a good lifestyle, and it's not the cleanest work in the world, but it's satisfying, and you get to do surgery, you get to round at the hospital, you do clinic stuff, so it's pretty dynamic." And so I applied to podiatry school, got in, and have been doing that ever since.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay, so 8 years now running it, and but you're not from Dallas, you said?
No, I grew up in northeastern Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, okay. Yeah, I haven't... I was there once for a wedding, 24 hours, and then I did a Spartan race, like an outdoor overnight race there once. It was like a 12-hour thing, and it was gorgeous, rolling green hills. Like, I actually fell in love a little bit with Pennsylvania for the short time I was there, because Texas is great for so many things, and Dallas is beautiful because you have that green belt of, the Arkansas, Louisiana, the green side of the deep south, and then you have the desert of New Mexico. And I feel like Dallas is that perfect middle ground where it's more humid than like a Nevada, but you're not sweating in the mugginess of like an Atlanta, So my point is, it's a little bit drier here, and we don't get the big trees like you do up in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Pennsylvania was beautiful. I did love the hills and the forest. We lived in kind of a rural environment in the northeastern part of the state. My dad built our house. He was an engineer and had done a bunch of contracting work when he was young. And I had an ideal childhood, shockingly ideal. And I was running around in the forests out there. It was very, very idyllic. Maybe not great for work. It is a state that's struggling after the changes in coal mining and things. So, kind of in the periphery in the big cities, you have a lot of activity, the universities there. But if you drive through the state, you'll see a lot of these old kind of forgotten towns that have seen better days. And it's interesting because it's kind of the keystone state for a reason. It's where the North meets the South. So that was interesting. You get a pretty good, robust 4 seasons. But I will say, coming to Texas, it's very socially dynamic here. It's easier to get together with people, easier to travel. A lot more work down here, so it's one of the reasons I decided to stay. I mean, I miss the environment of Pennsylvania, but for my financial well-being, Dallas is where I decided to maintain.
Everybody's moving here.
It seems like it,
and it has everything. Besides, unless you love beaches or mountains, Dallas has everything. Other than those two things, it has it all.
Yeah, you suffer for about 4 months with the heat. I mean, without air conditioners, I don't think so many people would be here.
That's true. I thought about the Alamo the other day. I was like, how in the world? I don't know if
people just suffered, man. People were tough in the past.
Just got through it.
Oh my gosh, right? You think about medieval winters, with peasants layering wool on, trying to survive.
Yes.
Bringing your cow into your hovel just to have it radiate heat so you don't freeze to death.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing what. That kind of blew my mind in Brazil, just to see the kind of extremity that people live in there. I was in the northeastern part of Brazil, and like, poor is poor there. It's, coming out of the United States from what you think is poor, and then you go to a country like that and realize a lot of the safety nets are just not there. And but despite all that, people are very happy there, shockingly happy. So
that's true, huh? Yeah. It's you're a kid in the U.S. and you're like, oh, that kid can't afford cold lunches, so his mom packs his. So he must not be well off. And you go down there, and a kid has never owned a pair of shoes, kind of thing.
Oh, I discovered my own country in Brazil. I never realized kind of what we had. I think one of the most shocking things is how people in the West have internalized law. So like you've probably stopped at a stop sign when a police officer wasn't there, right? So that's kind of an amazing thing. Like, why did you do that? No one was watching, right? I had a picture of a traffic jam I would show Brazilians because there's like 2 orderly lanes of cars, and then you have room where you could probably get another 5 rows of cars going, columns of cars, right? The Brazilians look like, what's going on here? I'm like, oh, well, you're not allowed to go outside the line. They laugh because in Brazil, it's kind of madness. People kind of do what they feel like, and unless there's an authority figure directly there with immediate consequences. You know, and society runs there despite the organized chaos, but it's very shocking when you get to the West here, and people almost everywhere have kind of internalized law, even to the point where people who are nominal atheists essentially live out a Christian ethic, right? They're like, well, you shouldn't hurt people. You shouldn't, they made that person feel bad. You know, it's very, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate how much of the Judeo-Christian worldview has just kind of seeped into the DNA of the West. And people kind of just think it's that way everywhere. And it really isn't. I've had a lot of friends who've spent time doing military service, you know, Afghanistan, Iraq. And, you know, when they come back, we have similar conversations about just how radically different some cultures are and how terrifying it is to be in one that doesn't really value the well-being of other people.
Yeah.
You know, humans have been tribal for a very long time, and tribal societies are typically very loving to people who are a member of the tribe. But if they meet someone they deem as a hostile tribe, they will take violent action. Yeah. If they deem it necessary, in a way that people in the West, you know, we have a tendency to look at people from foreign groups, and then we view them as a member of a shared human family, which I think is a beautiful thing, right? But that's just not the case everywhere.
Yeah, and it is an incredible, it's an incredible observation actually, because when I lived in Africa, that was the least well-off country I've ever lived in. Yeah. Traveled a lot, but lived and actually spent a long duration of time. It was mainly Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, Gabon, that whole Central African pocket there.
Yeah.
I mean, everything you're saying does ring true. The traffic laws. I don't think I saw a traffic light or a stop sign for 2 years while I was there. It was kind of the right of way at an intersection was who had the bigger car.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're a little taxi and there's a dump truck coming, like I'm going to let him drive first and pass. Pedestrians. They get the last right away. You're not stopping for pedestrians.
It's the reverse. It was the same thing in Brazil, because kind of if you go down like a Brazilian road, everybody's front yard, because they'll typically have a little kind of walled-in area with a gate, and it's very important to keep that gate shut, right? And then there's a bit of the sidewalk. Well, people have a tendency to kind of do whatever they want on the sidewalk. You'll have some guys got trees growing there, some other guys got like speakers blaring music into the neighborhood. Somebody else has just got a bunch of boxes there. Another person will have a clean sidewalk. So it's kind of hard to walk on the sidewalk. So people have a tendency to drift into the road to walk, and of course you're fighting with cars and things. Absolutely, and it all works in a way that you know, you took me a while. I kind of got used to it after a while, about 6 months. But then you come back to the United States, and you're used to that again instantly. Yeah, and then it's hard to go back. Like, you know, it took me about 6 months to get used to no air conditioning, and then I walked into a bank, and my travel companion almost had to drag me out of there. Yeah. And I was like, no, I'm not going back out there, man. I need this. I need a day in this.
Yeah, just one day with not sweating.
Yeah, it's the thing that's shocking. It takes so long to get used to uncomfortable things, and then it's just the moment you get comfortable again. You know, there's a story when Alexander the Great conquered Babylon, his, you know, war-weary soldiers started kind of getting a little comfortable. And they had the first week to say, by the third week, he's looking at these guys. He's like, I got to get these guys out of here. Yeah. They are not gonna conquer anything ever again. And he's like, where are we going? Well, east. We're going that way. He gets them out of Babylon back on the warpath, because I'm sure he looked around, and it's very easy to get comfortable.
They spend 1 week in the what is it? This ancient 7 wonders of the world. The
indeed,
gardens,
the hanging gardens, right? There's like, food everywhere, water, nice place to go to
foreign
the
bathroom. Girls,
women,
and like, we're not doing this.
Nope. You go soft, man, and I definitely feel that. I mean, even just getting used to being a medical resident, right? I remember kind of going from passive education as an elementary student, you know, where you kind of are in the 4th grade, so you can go to the 5th, and you're in the 5th, so you can go to the 6th, and you know, and then I got into residency, and you're just busy all the time doing things you don't quite know how to do. It's really like almost like a guild system, right? You have the residency directors, like the guild master, and if he doesn't decide to pass you off, you are not going to be a practicing doctor. So even if you have a medical degree or a DO or a DPM, if you don't complete a medical residency, you can't practice, right, in the States. And so the director really kind of holds your fate in his hands. And so for whatever time he has you for, he kind of, what he says goes. And just like in the ancient guild system, right, you got like the entered apprentice, the fellow craft, and you'll have the master. You got like the senior residents, and they kind of, abuse and direct the younger residents. So you kind of, you see one, you do one, you teach one. But it was very painful getting used to that. And then coming back out into to actually practicing medicine was easier than the residency. And I think that's kind of the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah. Kind of like a little boot camp.
No, it is. And I kind of get the feeling, I mean, you read these books about people who've gone through Ranger training, to get gold tabbed or training to get into SEAL Team 6 and stuff. And they typically say, yeah, war was not quite as bad as the training. I think that's an indication you had good training, right? You want to make that training worse than the actual thing you go through if possible. And I don't think there's enough of those things here in the West, initiations, right? Especially as a young man, you don't have to grow up in the West.
That's true.
You just don't have
to.
People didn't have a choice in the past. Now, I mean, you can sit around and think about it. We got video games. We've got infinite distractions. I mean, it's shocking to me that anyone gets anything done at all with the amount of entertainments and distractions that we have.
Yeah, it's true. I used to have the saying up on my mirror. I don't know if it's the ancient Spartans, but the sweat more in training and bleed less in war type of thing. And it's true. There's not. I was just having another guest on here the other day that we were talking about, the coming of age rights between a boy and a man. That's still prevalent in and it always kind of has been in human history, but maybe in some of the third world countries, some of the tribalistic societies, but for the most part in the West, it isn't. And I really liked what you said about the Judeo-Christian principle seeping into the DNA of what we have now. Because like you said, you'll stop at a red light you'll be a tiny town. There's one red light and you'll stop at it. And that principle serves some great purposes, right? But there are some ways that we have gotten so comfortable, so lax, and that the pressure is a good thing, I believe. It hasn't been put on men in the West in today's society where they have to grow up, like you said. So we have these Neverland boys from Peter Pan, and it's like, you can bring up this quote of sweat more in training to bleed less in war to some men, and they'll be, why would I sweat in the first place? I have AC. I have it's just there. It's crazy to me unless you've traveled outside of the U.S. Some places within, but mostly outside of the U.S. to a completely foreign country. There's just so many people now in the society that don't even comprehend that these things that they'll see on movies even still exist, and they don't know they'll get touched or moved by a film, but it's nothing the same as going and spending time out and actually doing it, like you were saying in Brazil or wherever.
Yeah, well, one of the other things I have noticed, though, is the longer you delay growing up or assuming all those duties, there's this gnawing anxiety that you have because you don't really know how to make it, and when you're younger, I don't think I ever appreciated till I turned 40 how many protections we have as like a child and then a boy. You have the layers of protection from your school, your dad, if you have a dad, hopefully. Society will give you loans, they'll give you money. There's all these protections and things that kind of keep you from the real chaos that life can be. And then you roll into your 40s, and what you're doing is kind of what you're going to be doing. And people aren't letting you borrow money anymore. They want that money back. And people are now depending on you, and you're now confronting chaos. And Carl Jung noticed that there's severe depression in these transitional areas. And he noticed that that guys in their 40s, a lot of them will hit this deep depression where you are finally there. And people say life is long, life is short. I found if you're enjoying yourself, life is short. And if you're not, life is long.
That's great.
And that's how it seems. And a lot of people, I have a lot of friends, we're in our 40s now. And if you don't like what you're doing, you're looking at your watch, man, it's going to be a long time. Another 40 years, oh yeah. And I think a lot of people in the West are getting a rude awakening. We see this with a lot of, the classic is the driven, career woman who's achieved everything, but didn't manage to have a family or get married, and they get about that age in the 40s, and they notice like, well, gosh,
Was this worth
I don't
it?
have that stuff.
Yeah.
And then like, well, how long am I? Oh, it's going to be another 40 years. That's a long, long time to be alone. And our society just makes it feel like you always have time to correct things. But I've noticed that's just not the case. There are these windows of opportunity, and I do think a lot of the ancient societies, they had initiations to help young men move along. Initiations among women less common. And I suspect the ancient thinking was, women's own bodies kind of initiate them.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
There's menarche is, where you go from the maiden to the potential mother, and then marriage not long after, then a baby. There's all of these these natural initiations that happen, very much so. But with men, it has to essentially be external and artificial.
That's true.
And it's interesting to see how ancient societies kind of intuited that.
Yeah, that is. Let's get into a little bit of that. Before we do, I want to ask you one question about what you think of today, because I did have this, again, I touched on this briefly with another guest a few days ago, but the thing that I heard that kind of resonated with me as far as the closest thing we have in the West to this boy becoming a man, time is, somebody said, I don't know if I read the quote on something online or where I heard this or read it, but there was a quote that basically said that the day that you realize that no one is coming to save you and that you take full accountability on yourself is the day you transition from a boy to a man. And it's kind of like what you said, like, no one's lending you money anymore. Now they want it back. Now it's like, wait. All the responsibilities coming down the shoulders, and there is no pad, there's no cushion. That's not a distinct moment, because that could happen to you. Some of these guys grow up in a rough area. That could happen to when they're 12. They have to turn into a man when they're 12 years old. Other people, they're 40 and still haven't hit that. So I was going to ask you, for you, what you feel like, if we have one, what might be kind of that coming of age or that boy to man transition, or not. We don't have really many true initiation.
Well, one of the sad things about the West is this process of atomization. We are losing a shared culture. Like, at least, I grew up in the 80s. We were all watching the same cartoon shows, right? So we all were watching Ninja Turtles and Transformers and stuff. So even if you didn't like what was on TV, it was what was on TV, and you go to school and everybody kind of talk about it, right? So there was some semblance, right, of a shared culture, even amongst the kids, with what's going on. Now, with the advent of digital media, everyone's off on kind of their own thing, and people often connect with these communities that are, remote from them. And, to your question, what is that initiation? Well, it just varies between people so much now because of that lack of shared culture. If you were a young man and you lived when World War I happened, World War I might have been a shared initiation. And certainly for all those old granddads you met that went through World War II, right, that affected them. Vietnam, for those who went to that in the 60s, certainly acts as that. But you look at something like COVID, and that reinforced infancy for many people, right? That delayed growing up for many of these kids who didn't get to see a mouth for 2 years. We only begun to see what kind of consequences that might hold for society. So, we don't really have kind of unified experiences. And I think, sadly, for a lot of men, it's just when you get a job that you hate, right? And you start having to provide for people or need people relying on you.
That is rough. That's rough, but I don't see a better answer. So
I yearn for a shared culture.
That is valid, because I noticed this the other day. There was some big breaking news thing. I think it was something about Trump. I think said something like he was going to get rid of a bunch of the Biden pardons because they looked like they were done by auto pen or something like that. Yeah. Which is a huge deal. But within 24 hours, not many people were talking about it anymore. It was on to the next thing. Right. And it was like, even when there is a point of a shared culture where we could come together, same thing. I remember there being like Disney Channel back in the day. There was like 5 shows growing up. Yeah. So at school, the kids that like that show sit over there. The kids like that. It was still kind of pretty. And I'm only 32, so this wasn't that long ago.
Wasn't it interesting? I remember we didn't talk about politics back then. we organized ourselves based on what you were into, right? Yeah. And even, I started at Penn State. I went to Penn State for my undergrad, and I was in 98. I graduated in 03. Mm-hmm. But even then, we never really talked about politics. All of my social circles there were ones I chose to go into, and they typically revolved around interests. Politics was always a secondary interest for most of us, Mm-hmm. And it's shocking to see how intense that that interest has become for a lot of people, really as a substitute for religion and shared culture.
Is that? Oh, that's a great. Actually, that's a great observation.
Well, it's complicated, but I do seem to notice that. It was intriguing. Like I remember a lot of my friends in college, we were always the ones who were interested in esoteric stuff, mythology, history, secret societies, all that kind of stuff. Those were the guys I kind of hung out with, and I'd say about half of them were atheists, and the other half of us were religiously oriented, and we never really cared. It was interesting, though. Many of my atheist friends became very obsessed with political activism in kind of the early 2010s, I noticed. And they had kind of lost their interest in the things that we all shared, and that kind of became their primary thing. And, because of Facebook, you can kind of keep track of these people. And for the rest of us who were kind of more religiously oriented, most of us kind of pushed into our religions more and got deeper into it. But it was interesting for me to see that my atheist friends typically were the ones that became more focused on politics as something that kind of looks like a replacement for religion, and a centralizing, organizing principle of people. It can serve that purpose, but of course it's very polarizing. And well, what was intriguing to me is to see a lot of them, superimpose moral value to their political opinions, right? Whereas before, you differ on politics, maybe we have a different understanding, but I think we've all seen that is now if you don't have the same political views, it's because you're a bad person, right? It was one of the sad things for me to see that. And, that kind of moralizing has a tendency to lead to really, really dark things. And I think we're all seeing that.
Yeah, that it is actually, you're not the first person that I've heard made that comparison, but it is so profound to just think of people that are longing for the community, people that are longing for the sense of camaraderie or whatever it is. And in today's remote and distance world of social media and working remotely and all of those things, just if that's what they have, even especially if they aren't religious, if that's what they have is a political outlet, then that's what they have. And if that's all they're seeing and that's what's being pushed through media sources or whatever it is, then it's like, pick a side, dig your back. It's primitive. I don't want to say primal, but it's primitive. But when I was in Africa, this would happen regularly, where we would be in a taxi. The taxi would bump into a motorcyclist, right? Or like all of a sudden, the taxi driver and the motorcyclist will get out and start arguing over whose fault it is. We're just in the back, another day, another dollar. We're rolling our eyes. All right, whatever. We're gonna get. But then all of a sudden, from the side of the street, some guy that didn't really see the accident, but sees a motorcyclist and a taxi man arguing. Well, he's a motorcyclist, so he's going to run into the street and start arguing with the motorcycist against the taxi man. He didn't even see the accident, but he's like, well, that guy's like me, and he must be one of my. So I'm going to jump on his side. Well, just so you like, the taxi guy, he's wearing a green shirt, and that guy over there is wearing a green shirt, and he's like, I relate to this guy. Then he just jumps in and starts, and they just would, the crowd would grow until you have 40 people. And at that point, we're getting out of the taxi. We're like, here's a couple bucks. We're going, we're just going to walk.
We're going to,
but it's like, it would blew my mind multiple times how the crowd would just grow and grow and grow. And then it's like, around comes this guy from picking up a fish at the market, and he sees his cousin in some big argument. He's like, I don't know what the argument's about, but I'm joining my cousin. And now everyone but the first two people has no idea what they're really there for, but they know that this is their team and that's the opposite team, and they start. Yeah,
one of the things I noticed about, I saw a lot of that in Brazil as well, but there was always a self-limiting principle, and that was this could get physical, this could get violent, especially between men, and that inherently would typically put a constraint on things. Well, to a degree, right? But when these kind of conflicts happen online and there's no threat of physical consequences, it has a tendency to just get out of control. I mean, 100%. Sometimes I imagine what it would have been like if Facebook was around during World War II, right? You can imagine the Nazis posting all the time about how much they hate the Jews, and people in the West arguing with them. And imagine if the two countries could have never gone to war. Would anything ever have been resolved with them arguing back and forth? No. I think about it. Is there any argument you could have totally smashed Nazi eugenicist? Is there any number of those posts that could have convinced the diehard fascists? And I don't think there is. It's interesting that it took physical conflict, and the fascist system was a morally relative one. I mean, even Mussolini admitted that, and one of his interesting arguments is the reason the fascists were fighting everybody is they had to determine who had the right to rule. And the only way for them to figure out who should be in charge is who can beat everybody else. Yeah. So if the Germans can defeat every other country, then they have the right to define morality for everybody else. And so ultimately only having their own nation destroyed by their enemies convinced them, the ones that were still alive. Well, I guess you don't get to set moral values for everybody.
Yeah.
It's kind of a shocking thing. So moral relativism just doesn't. It is not an end of conflict.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if morals are relative, then the person with the most power will simply enforce his morals on the rest. And that's a lesson I don't think a lot of my peers, people growing up, we always kind of viewed being morally relative and as a way to avoid conflict. And I think we saw a lot of that, and it worked for a while. But now in the online world, you can see that people are asserting their moral position. They can't really prove it to anyone, and you see the interest growing to enforce it on people.
Yeah.
And we've seen both sides of the political spectrum, look into censorship and using varying degrees of force, because ultimately, if we don't have a shared value system, people start looking at force again, and that's kind of I think the world we're starting to move into now. Francis Fukuyama wrote that book, The End of History, kind of viewing liberal democracy as the final form of political reality, where everything was well in hand in the 90s. We've come a long way from then, and we're seeing kinetic wars happening again. We're seeing people resort, even in the West, to terrorism. And I often hear people mention, it feels like we're in a movie, man. You notice that? Like this is, it's like we're in that weird timeline. Like the narrative world and the ordinary world are colliding now, and it's really intriguing to see that shift. And sadly, there's a lot of pent up aggression, and I hope it doesn't spill into outright violence in our own country. But I think we could all see that quickly happening.
Yeah, it is tough, because at the end of the day, only the threat of violence or violence itself really is enough to shock people into wait a second, maybe I see videos every day of people that will take a picture of their enemy. It could be a politician on the other side. It could be someone with a different opinion on the whole LGBTQ. It could be anything. But they'll take a picture and they'll stab it with a butter knife or something. It's but they're in their kitchen safe at home in Wisconsin, and the person they're against is over there in Oregon, so they don't have any threat of violence. So they're like, oh, I might as well, right? But that definitely throughout history, that's interesting. I didn't know that the fascists had that deep of a belief of he who has the biggest stick and wins the brawl gets to set all the rules. But I mean, humans have believed that for
fascist philosophy is sadly something people don't. Everybody hates the Nazis, at least say they do. But they had a robust philosophy explaining what they were doing, and a lot of people don't know this. Many of the Nazis, National Socialists, they were ex-Marxists, right? They had lost their faith in international socialism, right? Because Marx had posited that. Well, hey, all poor people are basically the same, so let's create a worldwide union of all the poor people. Well, the Germans had been experimenting with colonizing other countries, and the Germans learned very quickly that a poor African, a poor Gypsy, a poor Jew, and a poor German are different kinds of people.
That's true.
And many of them had said, well, what's wrong with Marx? This worldwide revolution hasn't happened because according to Marx, it was supposed to naturally occur in the most advanced country. So that would have been like Berlin, the most advanced city of the advanced country, and London is where that proletariat revolution was going to take place. And what it didn't happen. So the Marxists of that time went back to the drawing board, and there's something he missed. And what's interesting is the Nazis, these German National Socialists, were like, well, we can't create this utopia through forced inclusion, right? Which is kind of the USSR's ideal, right? Everyone's going to be forced to participate. They tried to create this socialist paradise through forced exclusion, right? And again, the justification, since they were essentially atheist, is that with Nietzsche's will to power, if we have more power than everyone else, then whatever we decide is virtuous is virtuous, because Nietzsche said the final phase of creativity is creating your own value system. And so the Nazis sought to create their own value system, and then of course relentlessly enforce it on everybody else, right? And it's interesting. I think that's one of the reasons that fascism was so universally unsuccessful is it's very hard to export that vision to like a non-German.
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
Whereas Marxism is very seductive to almost everybody because we all struggle with working and, life, even for wealthy people, sucks in a lot of ways. And, it sounds nicer and it's more exportable. So I think that has a lot to do with its success. It has better marketing, even though I think it's probably comparatively as murderous.
Yeah. And it is interesting because that philosophy of like whoever wins the battle, it gets to make all the rules has been around for, I mean, as they say, history is written by the victors, has been around since the dawn of human time, as far as I know. I mean,
that was the argument between Thrasymachus and Socrates, right? The Thrasymachus, the famous sophist, right? He said, strength is what the wolf does to the sheep. And Socrates is appealing to this ideal. He's like, well, there's an ideal. Like, how would you like it if you were the sheep? He's like, well, I wouldn't, but it wouldn't matter, would it? The world shows you what justice is, right? And so Socrates is pointing to this divine ideal. And that's something I think a lot of people are starting to learn, is that there's a lot of things that we do that cannot be justified by the natural world or just an appeal to evolutionary precedents, right? Like marriage. Like, I think men and women have a natural desire to be intimate with each other, but I don't think marriage is natural. And marriage always, even in the ancient world, was viewed as a heavenly or a divine institution. Actually, marriage works contrary to our natures, right? Mammalians are typically polygamous, right? Typically, the alpha gets all the females and all the other males don't get to mate. That's typically what happens. And marriage and monogamy in the West was a way to get more men to participate in building a family and getting civilized and almost anything else. And it's marriage seems almost entirely arbitrary. And intriguingly now in the West that we see marriage has kind of been discarded, we're reverting to kind of these weird polygamous systems where we have lots of women pursuing men of, the alpha guys, that you hear, men of means, and they have a tendency not to commit to any of them. And you see this weird form of neo-polygamy rising up here in the West in the midst of our decaying birth rate. So it's
a crazy time to be alive.
It is a crazy time to be alive. And it turns out our ancestors, a lot of the wisdom they inherited from the ages, they couldn't explain to you why marriage was important. And they lost those arguments, frankly. But now we're starting to see in the West, that, gosh, it's kind of looking grim. We don't even have enough people to repopulate ourselves. That's kind of a serious, any person who loves animals would be worried, like, hey, the animals aren't procreating in the zoo. We're not going to have any of these chimps anymore if they don't. And you can imagine it'd be a huge concern, right? If there was and there is. Anytime there's an animal population that's below replacement, but most of the Western nations now are below replacement. And we were told for years everybody's overpopulated, but now people are looking into this and they're like, well, hey, this. It starts slow, but then it starts to happen exponentially. Yeah. And if you don't have enough people,
a couple generations.
How many people in the world do you think it takes to maintain like the telecommunications system?
That's true.
To produce all of the high tech stuff. This is, I think, one of the reasons that Elon Musk mentions it, because he kind of knows how many people it takes to maintain the complex systems that we all rely on. And there is a certain number when we don't have enough people where like stuff starts going away. And, I don't know if we're going to live to see that, but the trajectory is kind of grim right now.
That's true. Yeah, it's a fascinating concept. I did hear that recently somebody brought up that idea that for the longest portion of human history, it was the alphas got most of the females, and then there was a bunch of men that were kind of the ones that honestly went to bleed and die in war. Those
that's
are the
absolutely
ones that,
right. Society has horrible things for the leftover men to do.
Yeah.
It always has. And that's right. You get too many of them, mysteriously a war happens, right? Or a plague runs through.
Gotta give them something to do, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, men find something to do. If they're not married and having kids, we all know this. We get up to other things. All the stuff you see, what do we like doing in video games? Like upgrading our character, shooting things, solving problems with violence, getting a faster tool or more points, and it's like, it's kind of what we would be doing.
That's true.
With other tribes or whatever, the behest of our brutal overlords, in an ancient society. So it's interesting to see the old wisdom come back.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to transition into this point because we initially we were talking about Freemasonry and Ancient Egypt, and we have the huge pyramids, which took. Whoever knows how many, thousands of these people it took to build them. We have these huge, gorgeous ancient cathedrals. I love traveling to Europe. I see these, especially Gothic. I am biased towards Gothic for whatever reason. I think they're gorgeous.
Well, it's just the most beautiful creation of of humans. It's solidified music. It's the divine ideals brought down into physical form and stored in stone. And I think one of the most beautiful things about those cathedrals is very few people who started building them ever saw their completion.
That's incredible.
They had such social cohesion that they could carry on the project for many times 400 years to finish many of these incredible cathedrals, which are just temples to more than just Christ and Christianity. They are temples to transcendent truth and spiritual reality, and it affects us. Right, you walk into one of these things, and there's nothing like it. Yeah. It affects you, right? And there's a reason that the things like Bauhaus architecture or brutalist architecture, it has a very different effect on people. I mean, when you do a dystopian sci-fi movie, you've got brutalist architecture there. It often has that kind of effect on people. So yeah, I agree with you. Our ancestors understood some very important things that we did not, and were willing to put a lot of time and attention. And it seems arbitrary, like why you build this big pyramid? In fact, the miracle to build the pyramids was a taxation system, that the Egyptians had enough scribes that they could track the resources in their country well enough to organize people to actually cut that stone in the quarries, put them on barges, float them to the location they needed to be in, true the stones, organize the guys into stacking all these things. It was really not slave labor. These were highly trained artisans and craftsmen, and anyway, we know that now, like the Khufu and Mycerinus and the Khephren pyramids, right? And so, these workers could not have been organized to this degree without very boring things like an advanced writing system and ability to track who owes what, and from that you get a civilization.
Do we even know where? I mean, because me not having researched, I've researched a bit into the ancient Egyptian world, but not as much as I'm sure you have. Do we know where this came from? Because we seem to have this period, thousands of years before the Common Era, or what do they say? 10,000 BC at least is when the pyramids were supposedly built. Is that?
Oh, no. They're much more recent. I mean, they're old. The step pyramid of Saqqara is built in the 3rd dynasty.
Okay.
All right, and that's the pyramids that you see. The 3 pyramids in Giza are put together in the 4th dynasty. Okay, and you're looking at about 2,500 BC to 2,800 BC.
Okay.
Are when these structures are put together. One of the nice things about the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, is that we can actually read their hieroglyphs. There are very few cultures where we can read that material from that time.
That's what I was going to say.
Well, you look, guys like Graham Hancock have found some amazing, megalithic structures, but it's utter speculation as to what their purpose might have been. I mean, there seems to be astrological correspondences to the structures, but I got to tell you, I mean, if you start lining up astronomical occurrences, most buildings you will find correspond to something. I mean, Stonehenge is very obviously a calendar, but there's a lot of speculation in that. The interesting thing about ancient Egypt is thankfully research into the hieroglyphs has allowed us to read this stuff better than ever before, and you can get a window into the mind of the Egyptians to see what they were doing, how they viewed the world, and why they were doing the things that they were doing. The step pyramid of Saqqara that you see in the 3rd dynasty. So this is an example of what we call petrification, right? So when you look at many of the structures in the buildings, they are stone representations of structures that would have been built by wood and reed and perishable structures. So it indicates that the ancient Egyptians were building temple structures out of perishable materials for a very long time before that.
Interesting.
And they had achieved a point in their unified Upper and Lower Egyptian kingdom, especially by the 3rd dynasty under Pharaoh Zoser or Netjeri-Khet, to create a permanent monument in stone. And that's what they do. And it does happen to be his funerary monument. The Egyptians, were always biased because their funerary structures were built out of stone. Stone structures are actually not very comfortable to live in. All right, so most of the palaces that the old kings would have lived in, or the pharaohs, well, that's a more recent term, would have been built out of mud brick. It's much more nice to live in a mud brick structure.
Better insulated?
Better insulated, easier to build, quicker to build, and just, infinitely more comfortable, right? And so those structures didn't survive. But many of their permanent monuments, namely the temples and the funerary structures, do survive. And for the ancient Egyptians, the temple and the tomb are intimately connected. And you asked, like, well, what really were they doing with something like the Giza pyramids? Well, you're looking at a part of architectural emphasis, right? I think the pyramids overemphasized. The most holy city in ancient Egypt was a place called Heliopolis, or Yunu. It's where present-day Cairo is basically built on the top of it there. And there was a temple, probably the most holy temple in the very early period of Egyptian dynastic history, and this was the temple to the sun god.
Yeah,
right.
Helios,
And yes, at Helios, and there was that temple to that god. And we
at
know
the time, was it Ra? Were they calling it Ra? Or at
yes,
the time,
Ra. So Ra.
Helios was the Greek later.
Well, Helios is a Greek. Yeah, so most of these names are Greek names that have been superimposed on the Egyptian names are harder to say. So Ra may have been Re. Remember, Egyptian language is mostly consonants, and you would fill in the vowels there. So nobody really knows how it sounded, right?
Okay.
I mean, Coptic is a modern day version of the final form of Egyptian language, kind of mixed with Greek stuff. So maybe there's similarities to it, but no, we really don't know how it sounded.
Okay.
But so Re was the god of the sun, particularly the sun at noonday. And so this temple had a part that emphasized the rising sun, and then the western part was to Atum, who was the setting sun. And in the middle, there was a sacred tree, and then this stone called the Ben stone. And that stone was probably kind of like a blunt obelisk. And all of these pyramid structures that you see for the 4th dynasty and 5th dynasty kings could actually be seen on a clear day if you drew a line from the Heliopolitan temple to the very tips of those pyramids. And what you were seeing is the tip of a Ben stone rising out of the sand. It is a symbol of the primordial mound, the first part of reality to rise out of the chaos waters. Wow. And beautifully, when the Nile used to flood, if you were around the Giza pyramid complex, and you can still see some old drawings of this, it looked like they were rising out of the chaos waters.
Wow.
And for the ancient Egyptians, what they were seeking to do is the interesting thing about their conception of society is they believed that in the beginning things were perfect. They called it the Zep Tepi, the first time. And in the beginning, God created the universe out of materials that already existed. So there was no creatio ex nihilo in ancient Egypt. So in the beginning, the ancient Egyptian priests envisioned a world of infinite darkness, this chaos waters. And actually in the Genesis account, you see this God's face moved upon the water. So the waters are already there, right? The chaos waters. And if you read the Genesis account, well, what's the next thing that happens? The waters get separated from the waters above to the waters beneath. A bubble is being created in the midst of this primordial matter. It's exactly how the Egyptians viewed it. There was a bubble, a space created in these chaos waters. So the Egyptians, when they looked up and saw the blue ocean, they saw that was the shoreless waters of the chaos ocean, and there was a dome protecting us from it. Okay. They also believed those waters existed beneath us, right? And the first thing that happened is Atum, after he separated these waters, created a little primordial hillock that rose out of the waters, and that was the first point of creation in the Zep Tepi, the first time. So every Egyptian ruler and even high priest at a temple every day is attempting to reconnect to the creative powers of the first time. In ancient Israel, they had a thing called a jubilee, which is supposed to take the king, back to Eden, back to the first time, the first creation, where everything was perfect, and then it begins to run down. Now, it's kind of interesting if you look at our modern view of creation. We viewed that, well, there was a Big Bang, and you learn that there was, this singularity, and nothing can get outside of the space-time. So that's a brain in the midst of maybe a bulk. You can imagine a hyperspace maybe outside of this, right? But if you're in the universe, you can't get outside of it. And then this primordial point explodes, so the light happens first, and then a space is created. So not only is time created, but space is created, right? So in the primordial, a few seconds after the Big Bang, maybe you could have traversed this infinite universe, quickly, right? Because it's tiny, but you would just keep circling back on yourself theoretically. Yeah. And so space-time is expanding now. And so it's kind of intriguing. Obviously the ancient Egyptians didn't know about this, but intuitionally, when you look at their description of a bubble was created in the chaos waters, it almost kind of sounds like a Big Bang. And even in the ancient Egyptian and the biblical account, the sun doesn't appear till later. So the sun appears on the 4th day in the Genesis account, right? So the light appears first, right? And then later, the sun appears.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, in the
Yeah, I
ancient
never thought of
Egyptian
that.
belief, the sun is a manifestation, one of the Ba's of Ra,
Of
but
the sun.
Ra is even superior in secret to that, right? So
Yeah.
by the New Kingdom in Egypt, they had come to conceptualize a hidden ultimate father god beyond even Ra, and they called him Amun, which means the hidden one, right? And what can you say about him? Well, he's hidden, right?
Yeah.
He is concealed in the daytime by the brilliance of the sun, and he's concealed in the darkness like the pupil of an eye at night, and yet his presence is everywhere. He was the hidden one who made himself into millions. So the New Kingdom Theban priests begin to speculate about this, and this is interesting to a lot of the Judeo-Christian religion, right? Christ is the manifest aspect of God, right? We see him like the sun. That's one of the reasons he has long hair, right? He's a solar being, right? The long hair is like the sun radiating. And yet there is a hidden father behind him he tells you about, right?
Yeah.
But we don't get to see that father. He is acting behind the sun. He is the first cause, right? Outside of the creation. And it's intriguing. The Egyptians seem to have discovered this, right? By the New Kingdom. And so there's a lot of interesting things that the ancient Egyptians are doing, and if you spend some time reading it, you'll find it. And I'm a Freemason, and one of the things that intrigued me, I go through the Masonic ritual, and it absolutely fascinated me. And I'm like, this is one of the most profound things I've ever experienced. Well, then I started spending a lot of time reading about what these priests were doing in their temple, and you can actually do that to a large degree. Now the Egyptians were pretty good at not spilling the beans, right? There's a lot of things they kept secret for reasons of decorum and sacredness. So I'll give you an example. We've all heard that Osiris was killed, right? Plutarch, this Greek priest, tells us that, right? Well, the Egyptians never explicitly mention that he's been killed. It was a taboo, right, to mention it. But everywhere you see allusions to and references to it. So it's kind of like everybody knew it, but no one would say it, right?
Okay, yeah.
I'll give you another example. The ancient Egyptians obviously saw eclipses. They never mention an eclipse, right? That probably would have been for them the most horrifying thing when you saw, like, be sure you don't write that down.
Darkness
right?
is overtaking God.
Yeah, so it will actually, the act of writing it would have given it life and power, right?
Oh,
so
interesting. Yeah, they're very, very sensitive to the power of words. Right?
absolutely they were, right? Saying a thing helps bring it into reality. And in fact, the Shabaka stone, which is something that was constructed by Pharaoh Shabaka, supposedly written based on this very early text. It's known as the Memphite theology, describes one of the creator gods, Ptah, bringing the world into existence through holy words, right? And these ideas seem to get carried down to Alexandria, and by the Roman period, you have these old leftover Egyptian priests talking to Jewish scholars and mystics and occultists and Roman priests and Greek priests, and Alexandria becomes this melting pot for these ideas, and that's where we get the Hermetic writings coming from.
Okay.
But just to get back to the Egyptian ritual, so I go through this stuff and it amazes me, and so I start reading about the rituals and particularly some of the greatest mysteries of ancient Egypt, and I see these shocking parallels. Right now, I don't believe the ancient Egyptians that there was an unbroken chain of secret masters who carried this all the way down. But what's intriguing to me is the men who put Freemasonry together, for reasons that nobody really knows, and we probably never will know, recreated some of the most sacred and intimate aspects of Egyptian religion. And I think of all the things we do in modern society. If you were to bring an ancient high priest of Jerusalem, right, and an ancient Egyptian high priest and a Greek high priest, and you were to show them all the things we do in modern society, our religion, they would have been like, okay, religion is good, but the rites and rituals of Freemasonry, I think, would have felt most at home to them.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that was a kind of a shocking thing for me to discover, that really in a Masonic lodge you are connecting to some of the most ancient and sacred things that the human family did.
And tell me, I have two questions with that. The first is, do you know why, or is it known at all why the Freemasons chose, of all the different religions, of all the different histories, of all the different time periods they could have chosen, why is it that they chose the ancient Egyptian religions to mimic so closely?
Well, they did not choose it, okay? So this is, all right, let's get into a little history about Freemasonry. So Freemasonry seems to start as a stonemasons guild. Some of the earliest accounts are in the 1300s. Now, here's something a lot of people don't know. Have you ever heard of a mystery play before?
A mystery play, yeah.
Yeah, so, you're a medieval guy, you go to high mass, there's a lot of Latin, there's beautiful pictures on the stained glass. Little hard to get it together.
Yeah,
What would often
know what's going on very well.
Yeah, so what would often happen in these communities is, there was a guild system in medieval and Renaissance Europe, and the guild system was a trade organization.
Carpenters guilds,
you got it. And they kept there's good things about it and bad things about it, right? Your candlestick maker, your cooper, all these people. Well, the guilds had a tradition that what they would do is they would put on plays representing stories in the Bible. So they would typically they would do it during these high holy days and festivals. And, the Catholic Church they didn't really like it a lot, but they kind of tolerated it because it was so popular with the people. So you'd go to mass, but then you'd go and catch a mystery play. And they would say, okay, we're going to put on a play of the creation of the world, right? All right, this guy's Adam, this guy's Eve, and probably the guild master gets to be God coming down, right? A lot of these little Monty Python skits you see are kind of reminiscent of these mystery plays. They would have props and all kinds of things, and each guild would kind of put on a different play, right?
And just so I know, the Catholic Church didn't love it because their control over the populace by the Bible only being allowed to be spoken and written in Latin, which really only they knew, was being threatened by the populace understanding the stories of the Bible through another means, being these mystery plays.
I'm sure there were various reasons. I haven't studied this too much, why they were displeased, but typically you had something happening in the vernacular, the common tongue, and it's just kind of happening outside of the auspices of the church. I think another reason is a lot of these were kind of baudy and there was
they were very exaggerated.
Yeah, it's happening outside of a sacred place. It's happening more in public, right?
People are drinking.
Yeah, you got it. Now, intriguingly, in ancient Egypt, there was no church on Sunday. How did the common Egyptian interact with his local temple? During festivals. During festivals, that was the only time he would get to see inside the temple to any degree. All the doors of the temple would open. The god would be placed in a shrine, placed on a boat, brought outside. People are having fun. And the Egyptians would put on theatrical reenactments of significant things that happened in mythological history. And just like Christians have a liturgical year, where every year we kind of role play the important things that happen in our scripture, the Egyptians had a liturgical year, right? All the ancients did this, right? So every year there's special festivals that commemorate mythological patterns. And for the ancients, something was most real if it had a mythological precedent. Marriage was based on a mythological precedent of the gods being married, right? The fight between chaos and order, there's, of course, infinite stories about this, right? Between Ra and Apep, the chaos serpent, between Osiris and Set, and then later Osiris's nephew, right? So these guilds, they're putting on these mystery plays, right? And so the mystery plays are very popular. And the Stonemasons Guild, we don't really know what happened exactly. In Scotland, one of the kings orders the Stonemasons Guild to begin keeping minutes. And so we have minutes of this Stonemasons Guild talking about
basically just a journal of what's happening during their meetings.
Correct. Well, they're basic things, right? Very simple. And many of these documents are preserved. And again, we know very little about what they were doing. But as the years go by, the Stonemasons Guild, at least in Scotland and in England, begins to change character a little bit. It's quite an interesting thing. By the 1600s, men who are not operative Masons are joining this guild. So a guy like Elias Ashmole, who is essentially an alchemist and philosopher and hermeticist, the guy probably hasn't swung a hammer in his whole life. He becomes a member of a Masonic lodge. And in these days, the way the Masonic lodge would work, when it was actually an operative organization, is so a bid would be made to build a cathedral, right, or some other stone structure, and the local guild would get the contract, and one of the men, because there were fellows and apprentices, would be made master for that project. And he would build a temporary structure near the cathedral where the plans would be drawn up, and this was a lodge, a temporary wooden structure. Typically, there would be dirt on the floor, and he would draw his designs there, and the entered apprentices and the fellow crafts would come in, and he would set the work, set the workers to labor for that contract, right? And so you can imagine there's a certain ritualistic form to this thing. And intriguingly, this man who's in charge of this is building cathedrals, so he's learning about divine architecture, divine geometry. He's learning about all of these principles, right? And these principles are being shared amongst the workers. It's a really interesting thing. Well, to kind of flash back to ancient Egypt, so if you go to the Valley of the Kings, how the heck did they build these complicated tombs? Well, there is a little town, a workers' village, Deir el Medina, which was a group of highly trained artisans who lived in, now these were permanent structures, but they would sally forth from Deir el-Medina, and they would go post up, build a temporary structure near the king's tomb, and they would go dig down. And these guys learned all kinds of the secrets of the pharaoh and of the priesthood in order to be able to build these structures. And they were very literate, so we know a lot. They wrote back and forth with each other and things. And they started building their own mini religious structures within Deir el-Medina so that they could participate in these things as well. So I'm just giving you an allusion to something happened along. Now, ancient Egypt doesn't have official guilds, but they have kind of a father-to-son transmission system where high level, I mean, you got to think about this. It's like 4,000 years of continuous culture. I mean, you look at hieroglyphs from the earliest period to the latest period, and they're still, similar, right? So that's a pretty shocking accomplishment.
Yeah. So
back to our Masonic guild. So these temporary structures are being built, and that's kind of the prototype for the lodge. Well, by the 1600s, we start to see that this kind of interactive thing is happening, where we see the rise of something we call in Masonry speculative Masonry, where these men are meeting together. They're putting on some kind of participatory ritual. Now, and again, we don't know a lot about it. You start to get written documents sharing some of these things from that time period. Often what they would do is they would rent a tavern, have a dinner together, go to the upper floor, and they would draw the stations of the lodge, some of the kind of symbolic stuff. They would put on their ritual, and then they would erase it. There was one guy, a guy would have a mop and pail, and he would erase it, because you would keep these things secret. And, people always talk about the secrecy. Why is it secret? Well, these trade organizations kept their secrets very closely. And if you look at, any religious system, the highly sacred stuff is also treated with a modicum of secrecy. Even the Catholic Church in the medieval era, the transubstantiation happened behind a veil, like in a concealed area, right? It was an innovation to drop that and let the whole congregation actually see what was happening with that, right? So secrecy and sacredness are always intimately connected, right? Well, Freemasonry begins to transform and kind of federalize. So in the year 1717, a group of lodges, 4 of them in particular, come together and they form the Grand Lodge of England, right? Okay. And they begin putting in requests for these other lodges to submit their written documents. And we start to see Freemasonry become standardized. However, the moment the stuff started getting written down was the moment it kind of transforms from what it may have used to be, right? Because ideally, this stuff is never supposed to be written. It's supposed to be transmitted mouth to ear, right? It's supposed to be lived and participated in. Well, if Masonry didn't have things written down, it probably wouldn't have been as preserved as it was, right? But we see Masonry transform from a trade organization to a gentleman's fraternity, and we see the rituals that they do begin to complexify. And that's when we start to have some of the first expose, like an expose known as Masonry Dissected, where this guy reveals all the secrets of Freemasonry. And an interesting turn of fate, many Masonic lodges may have been formed, got this expose, and used it to kind of recreate a local Freemasonry in their region. So you see how this stuff can kind of spread.
And this is 1700s.
This is the early 1700s, that's right. Now, everybody asks, well, what is Freemasonry? Well, it's interactive theater is really what it is. And in the 1700s, they focused on the story of the building of King Solomon's temple. Okay. This was something that is reenacted to a degree, and as a Mason, you take on roles and you perform in this interactive play, and every member of the lodge has different things to do, kind of like a mystery play. And in ancient Egypt, things like this happened too. Hey, you're going to be set for this play. Oh, I love being the bad guy. You're going to be Horus. And they would put on plays. Some of these plays,
teach the people.
Some of these plays were very public and everybody could see it. However, the Egyptians also had other plays that were performed in a very sacred and controlled environment, some of their greatest secrets. And Freemasonry really, with the Anderson Constitution, focuses on this story of the building of King Solomon's temple. But you can see it as an allegory for the building of the universe, right? The building of a temple is symbolically the building of the world, right? Now, one of the things that was very important to the Freemasons of the early 1700s, they had just kind of gotten out of the 30 Years' War. So religious violence and sectarianism was fresh in everyone's mind. So these guys who put together the Grand Lodge, John Anderson and Theophilus Desaguliers, a Frenchman, he was actually a Protestant Huguenot who had fled France because of the persecutions there. They were very focused on creating an institution that represented transcendent religious ideals in a non-dogmatic and non-sectarian way. They wanted the lodge to be a place where a man of any faith could come and participate, but you still have to agree on some higher principles. And for them it would be pointless to do it if you were an atheist, right? So they focused on a story that everybody could accept, and this was the building of King Solomon's temple. And kind of one of the nice things about that is a Jewish man could participate, because you're not overtly talking about Christ. Any Christian can participate. Even a Muslim man could participate in this. Yeah, so it's inclusive in that way, and focused on toleration and also non-dogmatic. So in Freemasonry, the play is presented, and there are official interpretations of some of the symbols, but every Mason is encouraged to interpret its meaning for himself, right, as he goes through this. So it's interactive theater. And one of the central mysteries in Masonry is, how do we deal with death and transition? The master dies, and yet the guild carries on, right? Now, ancient Egypt was highly focused on this. One of the central mysteries in ancient Egypt is the death of the god Osiris. It's pretty much the Lion King story, right?
Okay.
With Simba and Mufasa, right? So Osiris is the good but perhaps blind king who serves to create an ideal society, but is deceived by his brother Set. And Set, and this is an intriguing principle, the Egyptians are showing that evil has crept into even the family of the gods. So evil is that pervasive, because one of the final realizations you have is, well, evil is outside of us, evil's in another tribe. The Egyptians have gotten to the point where they're telling the stories, they're like, evil can be in your own family. Your own brother could be possessed by evil. Now, Set is really a chaos god more than a god of evil, but in the story of the death of Osiris, he definitely serves as an antagonist, right?
Okay.
In this story, Osiris is tricked by his brother and is killed, or at least as killed as a god could be, right? Now, his wife Isis goes to great pains to find his body. He's put in a coffin, floated in the Nile, and he drowns. He's not fully dead. She finds the coffin. It's actually grown up into a tree. She cuts the tree down, pulls the coffin out, takes it to a hidden place, and she sits on top of the body and is posthumously impregnated by Osiris as really his final act. And that is the Immaculate Conception idea, where his Osiris's son, Horus, who is the rightful heir of the kingdom, is now in Isis's womb, and she uses her magic to do this. And of course, the story gets much more complicated than this. Set, meanwhile, finds the body, tears it up, and spreads the pieces all across ancient Egypt. And every region, as time goes by, comes to be home to a part of Osiris. His head lands in Abydos. His thigh is on Elephantine, which is the place where the Nile supposedly originates. So Isis then goes, finds all the parts of the body, reassembles the body, and with the assistance of Anubis, mummifies it. Now, Horus has grown into a young man, and he is hunted by Set. Horus's uncle, provides an enemy for him. This is just like the Lion King story. But finally, what happens, and this is one of the really interesting parts, is Horus defeats Set. And then he finds the mummy of Osiris, which is an Abydos, all right, which is kind of halfway between Upper and Lower Egypt. And this body is taken for final interment at Heliopolis. And Horus does one of the most secret things in ancient Egypt. Horus travels to the underworld, bringing the secret knowledge of the high god Ra, and he goes down to the lowest, darkest depths of the underworld. And in the 6th hour of the night, he finds Osiris in a state of weakness. And Horus, in a moment of supreme intimacy, embraces and raises his father up. And Osiris's essence is transmitted to Horus. Horus's essence is transmitted to Osiris, and they in essence become one. Osiris has to stay in the underworld. That's the sad part of the story. And he will stay there to judge the dead. So the suffering god in ancient Egypt, very similar to Christianity, stays in the underworld to judge between the virtuous and the wicked dead. Horus returns to the land of the living. So he's descended into the underworld, not unlike Orpheus, right? Orpheus, who goes down into the underworld, or many of these other stories of when a hero goes into the underworld and then comes back to the world of the living. And Horus then punishes the enemies of Osiris who had helped out Set. Set is castigated and put into a deferential position. He ends up working for Ra on his boat, helping Ra to fight the chaos serpent. And then Horus establishes the principle of kingship, and he rules, bringing the principle of Osiris back to the earth. And so every pharaoh was imitating Horus, right? He was taking upon himself this archetypal pattern that Horus showed. And this is kind of all of us, right? Our dad dies, and we're supposed to become our dad. And in the darkest part of the night, we confront our father and ask if we can be like him. So this happens in The Lion King, right, where Simba looks into the water, right, at the low point, and he sees a reflection of his father. Luke Skywalker goes down into Dagobah. Down there, what does he find? He finds his father. The Masonic story has a lot to do with this as well. Hiram Abiff is slain, and he doesn't come back, right? But you, as the candidate, have to assume the mighty office that he has and continue this quest to rebuild the temple all around you. And it's basically the Egyptian story, right? That our fathers die, we have to commune with them and then bring something back from that underworld. This is basically the rebuilding of culture and the continuity and continuation of culture. And we're threatened by chaos all around. I mean, Jordan Peterson talks about this stuff all the time. But when you really delve into some of these Egyptian netherworld books, because they had all of this mapped out. The Egyptians had the entire underworld journey mapped out, all of the 12 hours of the underworld, all of the gate guardians, all the stuff that you had to say to get to one place to another. They viewed it as a highly regulated realm. And it is likely that the Egyptian temple was similar to this, with gate guardians and probably questions and answers to pass. So every day the high priest in ancient Egypt would go into his temple. He would be washed, anointed, reclothed in holy clothing, essentially being activated as a god. And what is the high priest doing? He's taking on the identity of the pharaoh. And what is the pharaoh doing? He's taking on the identity of Horus. And what is Horus doing? Horus is ultimately taking on the identity of his heavenly father, Ra. And there's a story about how Isis got the secret name of Ra and gave it to her son Horus so that he would be able to revivify Osiris in the underworld in order to create this continuity. So for the ancient Egyptians, the heavens are up above, the underworld is beneath us. Their question was, how can I have a meaningful relationship with the gods above, even though they're not here, and my dead ancestors below in order to make life worth living? So they had a non-morbid way of communing with their dead ancestors, and the ancient Egyptians would often visit their ancestors' tombs, and there were rites and ordinances they could perform, typically on a representation of their ancestor in statue form or on a mystic door. You see these doors, these faux doors all over ancient Egypt, and typically an offering would be made. Water would be poured out, and the hope is that the Ba, or the spirit, right, or Ba is really more associated with the soul of your ancestor, would come and manifest there, and you could commune with them. And, one day you'd be going where they were. And, of course, the Egyptians didn't believe that you stayed in the underworld forever. They believed the ultimate destiny of the virtuous dead was to rise and be exalted and join the family of the gods. And that's an exciting thing that was discovered by an Egyptologist, Hayes, in his paper, The Death of the Democratization Theory, was that even in the Old Kingdom, common or at least elite Egyptians in their tombs have evidence of them receiving the same rituals and ordinances that the pharaohs received. So this was something that all the Egyptians, seemed to have a hope that in the afterlife they could be perfected, forgiven of their sins. That was very important to them, and help participate in their progeny, continuing this project down on earth, and that they would join the family of the gods as a peer. And it's a very beautiful and optimistic vision of existence. And the Egyptians really see theosis as the final hope of humanity. Really, humanity is described as the tears of Ra. We are sparks or emanations of the first God, and the ultimate hope they have is that perfected humanity could return and join with God. And then what do? Well, you do what Ra does every day. You fight chaos, the chaos serpent Apep, who can never be defeated but only kept back. It's just like you can never wash the dishes so well, you never need to wash them again, right? Or clean your room so well, it never needs to be cleaned again. And this seems to be the centralizing narrative of all of ancient Egypt, and maintained a continuous culture for 4,000 years. I mean, the people living in Egypt to this day are the genetic descendants of ancient Egyptians, right? It's the same people that have been living there continue. There's very few places on earth where you can see that. And then the intriguing thing is that these Freemasons, and you got to understand, many of these 18th century Freemasons were highly ambivalent and dismissive of the rituals. They're like, oh, we put on these silly plays, doesn't really mean anything. But they are reenacting rites that imply, and remember, these are devout Christians. People see Freemasonry, they're like, oh, you're doing some kind of necromantic thing. Nothing could be farther from the truth. They are putting on plays that are non-denominational, that imply that human beings have hope of participation in a divine heavenly temple, that they can have a meaningful interaction with their family, friends, and community, that everybody's participating in the rebuilding of the spiritual temple and the renovation of the world all the time. And that you can do this, but yet you have to find a way to organize with people. And this is the interesting thing, is Masons figured out, Freemasonry understands men, right? Like, we need a reason to get together. I can't just call you, man, I'm kind of lonely. You want to get together? We'll put on a play.
We'll talk about our day.
Yeah, you want to put a play on together? You want to dress up? But it's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
There's a mission, right? We meet, we do this. Like, I've heard debates, and one of the contentions an atheist has is like, well, I could meet on Sunday and I could keep all the religious commandments that a Christian does. Like, you certainly can, but you just probably won't.
Yeah,
right?
you don't do it.
Yeah, Freemasonry understands men. There's an excuse. We get together, we eat, put on these degrees, and why do we do it? It's because we do it. But if men don't have an excuse or a reason to meet, they don't get together. And it's shocking, from 1717 till now, there's been a pretty, there's all kinds of modifications that have happened, but the core of it is basically the same. And it has persisted to this day, and it has shocking similarities to a lot of these ancient activities that we're engaged in. And, I joined because I was kind of feeling divorced and atomized from my community, and it was amazing. I joined in a little lodge in Rockwall, Texas, and I got to know local police and some firemen and some people on city government. They were all there, and these were great guys. And like, I knew them, and then I would have never met these men or really have known them or had a relationship with them if it weren't for this excuse to get together. And I've just seen people's lives transformed by having something like Freemasonry to participate in.
Tell me this: because Freemasonry is a male organization
Correct.
right now. Talking about the Egyptian religion and where they drew their inspiration from, were there female? Because I've heard, female priestesses. They obviously had female goddesses.
They did.
But as far as like the priest body itself, or the people actually doing the rituals and upkeeping the temple, were those all male or?
Mostly. So here's an interesting thing. So in the Old Kingdom, the oldest period, there was not a professional priesthood.
Okay.
Common people, or at least, we don't know exactly how high up on the social echelon you had to be, but at least, mid-level social people would serve for a period of time, every year. So you could actually sign up to become a priest, and for like a third of the year, you'd be on this corvée, this file, they called it, a rotating priestly duty. And for that time, you would fulfill the taboos. You'd get shaved. They depilated your entire body. You got circumcised. You had to be circumcised to be a priest. They were doing that.
They're going through a whole initiation.
Oh, absolutely. That circumcision happened.
So that wasn't a Hebrew thing later on.
Well, intriguingly, many of the Hebrew rites have a lot of similarity to Egyptian rites.
Which came after Egyptian or before? After.
Well, it depends on who you ask. But right, the Hebrew people, as they leave ancient Egypt, they build the tabernacle, which is this portable tent temple.
Yeah.
And if you look at it, it is based on the pattern of an Egyptian axial temple. It seems that God is communicating to the Hebrew people using symbolic things that they would have understood.
That they knew. Yeah.
Absolutely. And circumcision was a ritual of the Egyptian priest. And we see that instituted in ancient Israel as well. And it's intriguing.
Sorry to cut you off. Not the common people, just the priests specifically. That was like a religious.
It seems to have been. We don't know how common this was, but you can see, and there's bas reliefs of Egyptian priests getting circumcised. It's quite explicit. He doesn't look happy. Having it done. But
if he's middle of his life,
Oh yes,
instead of children,
he is right. And so then you ask, right? So how extensive was this service? You would do that for about 3 months and return to whatever your normal vocation was.
Wow.
By the New Kingdom, the priesthood is a fully professional organization. And
Okay.
later in Egyptian history, we see more priestesses. But women do seem to be involved in every aspect of Egyptian religion, right? And yes, there are goddesses that the Egyptians are very sensitive to having their gods paired off, married. Now the sole god Ra and Atum is kind of a different version of Ra. They don't have an official spouse, but the eye of Ra is viewed as feminine, right, and referred to in that way. Iret is eye in Egyptian, and the T ending is a feminized form, and so the eye of Ra is viewed as almost a womb or a feminine thing, and from the tears of the eye is where human beings came from in their religion. But almost all the other gods, Horus is married off to Hathor. Osiris has Isis as one of his wives. Nephthys, his brother's wife, seems to gravitate over to him as well. They are sensitive to that. By the New Kingdom, well, I shouldn't say that. By the Ptolemaic era, you have these things called mamisi or birth houses, where there are these little appurtenances in Ptolemaic temples that celebrate the birth of a child god from a divine couple. All right, but how extensive were the priestesses' activities? We don't know. We know they danced and sang. There was the sistrum, which is the rattle. We know that women were involved in this thing called the Acacia House, which seems to have something to do with butchering animals from a very early period of time. So, women in ancient Egypt are fully integrated into their society, and as time goes by, it seems they participate more officially in the rites and rituals. But during these interactive theatrical performances, they're all there, engaging in stuff as well. But I should say most of the high ritual activity is performed by males.
By males, right?
Yes.
So tell me this, because what you mentioned about the Egyptian belief about the gods existing above them, there's the underworld, and then there's us in the middle, kind of trying to make sense of it all, also feel connected to both, so we can have deeper meaning and fulfillment and things in this current life. So that was kind of the purpose with them and their religious practices, their temples, the rituals that they did. Comparing that to modern Freemasonry, where it's specifically not religious, like it's purposely not religious. You have to believe in an entity, a god, or have to believe in something, but it's not. The organization of Freemasonry isn't going to try and steer you one way or another. So then the question or the purpose of modern day Freemasonry, is it mainly like what you said, to feel connected to other people, or is there something else outside of that?
Well, I don't think there is any official purpose. Freemasonry kind of happened. Like, you see these men putting pieces of it together. None of them seem to fully understand or comprehend what they're doing. It's filling a deep need that was not entirely being fulfilled by their society around them. Now, I think it's significant that Freemasonry seems to rise as a modern institution in England. Many of these men were Protestants, and the loss of the Catholic Church and its central role in a community, I think, may have been a bit disorienting for many of these men, and finding maybe the Protestant form of worship was a little light on ritual, and this just deep need to act out the things that they understood. We in Western society, we have a tendency to verbalize everything, talk about stuff, we externalize it. This is like meta discussions about religion, about the nature of belief and things. Ancient religions weren't really that way. It was something you did or performed. There was an ancient philosopher known as Iamblichus, and Iamblichus was quite negative towards some of the Greek philosophers and Neoplatonism. In his book De Mysteriis, he talks about, like, hey guys, you're talking about it too much. Like, you got to do theurgy, God working. Like, you got to be in the temple. You got to be fasting, making sacrifice. You got to do it. It's doing it is where it comes alive, not talking about it, right? It's like you can talk about a diet so much you excuse yourself from needing to do it, right? We've seen like you can talk about something so much that you just don't do it and something's lost. So you ask, like, the purpose. I don't think any individual Mason ever really knew. But what we do see is if it wasn't secret, it would have fallen apart. If you just did it open and it was done publicly, it would have been open to ridicule and criticism. That wouldn't have worked. So keeping it secret's the only way it's been kind of preserved in some form of order and purity too. it's acted out as a play. Like you would not believe some of the performances these good old boys put on.
Okay.
Like there is this need we have to participate in the stories. It's not, I mean, you remember a little kid, you'd like watch Star Wars, and then you're like, man, I gotta be Star Wars.
I want to go.
Give me the
Mom,
lightsaber.
buy me the lightsaber.
Yeah. We in the 80s, that was all about it. You watch it, and then you do it, right? You participate in it. Freemasonry seems to fulfill this deep need we all have to participate in these things. And in particular, these men wanted to act out these divine principles that gave them the most hope that man is virtuous and has a potential, or I should say man can be virtuous and has a potential to create something of lasting beauty, that there's a purpose to our lives. And one of the big things about Freemasonry, there does seem to be a hermetic element to it. And what I mean by that is when the hermetic literature was rediscovered in the 1400s, one of the interesting ideas that it puts forth is not just that man is perfectible and can be elevated like a saint, but Hermeticism is different from Gnosticism is very negative on the material world, right? The Gnostic worldview, the demiurge as a wicked being who created this filthy world of matter that dirties us, and the Gnostics want to return to a world of pure spirit and escape the shackles and prison of the body, right? In Hermeticism, matter is viewed as a challenge to be perfected along with the human, right? The whole rectification of the world is hoped for by Hermetic literature. Okay. And this stuff is rediscovered in the Renaissance, and it spreads like wildfire amongst these intellectuals. Elias Ashmole is one of these men who gets it. And this idea seems to have sparked some aspects of the Renaissance, where this concept of not only can man be perfected, but we can turn this world into a heaven on earth. We can elevate the ideas of alchemy. We can turn all the lead into gold. So even the whole creation can be saved along with man, this transformation of the world. And Freemasonry seems to really resonate with that. Like, not only are we going to try to make ourselves better, but in performing these things, we're going to reach out into our communities and try to perfect everything. And if you look at the roster, I'm a Mormon. I'm a Latter-day Saint. I believe in a high standard of moral behavior. When I was looking at Freemasonry, one of the things that made me want to participate is the fruits of these men. If you look at the roster of Freemasons throughout history, some shockingly incredible people who performed great things and improved the world all around them, and really believed in that vision of being able to elevate the world along with themselves. And that's something I really note as a healthy thing. Like, Freemasons are fully integrated into their communities. I got a lot of friends into all kinds of things, and I've noticed with a lot of mystic organizations and small occult groups and things that as a person descends into those, they often lose their ability to integrate with their community around them. There's a tendency to become insular and kind of withdraw.
It starts borderlining on cultism. Like, it starts.
I've seen people kind of get lost in that. And Freemasonry is very, very grounded. And Masonry has all kinds of different flavors and different lodges. Some lodges are more mystically focused. Some are more philosophically focused. Here in the United States, there's a real religious element to it, in that it really emphasizes the moral teachings as one of the preeminent markers of a good Mason. And so there's all types, but they really do stay grounded and fully integrated into the community around them. And I see that genuine success and need to elevate the world around them. And as I look back at the ancient Egyptians, despite all of this mysterious stuff that they're doing, embalming corpses, and burning incense, and performing sacrifices of animals in order, it's basically what your local butcher does, but just embellished more. But despite all of that, when Herodotus came and visited them, he said these are a life-loving, life-affirming, healthy, clean people. He was very impressed with them. And they seem to have kind of caught the vision, and it carried them for long periods of time. And I'm very interested in things that can help renovate the West, because I think we all feel that kind of loss of grounding. What are we going to organize around? And just organizing around politics or an economic system. It's just not. It's not enough. It's not sufficient.
It's too superficial.
It is something like Freemasonry is holding its own to try to stabilize things. And though not a lot of men are in it, I have hopes that it will increase in popularity. And we already see kind of a return to religion. A lot of people are having. But one of the things I love about Freemasonry is it provides a grounding in a non-denominational way. So I can come together with people who share those values, but don't necessarily share my faith, and that's been very satisfying for me.
And it's almost, I mean, it sounds like it's almost like, not exactly, but you could almost draw a parallel kind of to what we were talking about earlier, how you have these atheists that pick up politics as a way to, how do I want to say this? It's a social outlet for them in a way where they can get together and feel like they're part of a mission or a movement, or they have a connection to something. You're saying that when this time period was in the 1800s and this Protestantism kind of took the normal Catholic glue that had held these communities together, when that was removed by the Protestantism and the revolts and revolutions, that Freemasonry was a good substitute that kind of came in and gave them a feeling of community in the sense of...
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be that way. Protestantism is prone to denominations. And these denominations, though they share a lot of values, are, they have a different name for a reason. They are separate congregations. Yeah. And, I think...
Read the same Bible, but
exactly.
completely separate.
Well, the interpretations are very different. And these guys who put together the Grand Lodge, I think, did an excellent job at creating something that we could all agree on, that's beautiful, that brings us together, and kind of was a move away from that kind of religious segregation that you find many times in Protestantism, right? And I think it worked. I think it was miraculously successful. Attempt at moving in the other way. However, due to its secrecy, it's often maligned and misunderstood.
Yeah, as most things are that are secret.
Well, I mean, we all have a tendency to suspect somebody's up to no good.
When they say that there's a secret, it must not be a good secret.
Well, I mean, obviously, right? People, and there have been some political scandals, with Freemasonry, like the Morgan affair in the United States, and the P2 incident in Italy, that the P2 Lodge incident, where there was a bombing, and it had to do with this political movement that wanted to create a false flag event. That was, gosh, I can't remember if it was the 70s or the 80s that happened. Again, that left a stain on the opinion people had towards Freemasonry. But one thing people don't understand is that there is no supreme secret council of Freemasons that just run all of them. Every Grand Lodge in the world...
worldwide?
Worldwide, that's correct. Every Grand Lodge is autonomous. Every state in the United States has its own Grand Lodge. And each one of these is autonomous, so they maintain cordial relations with every other Grand Lodge. They are independent bodies. There is no supreme secret organization that's controlling the actions of all Masons. Even if something like that somehow arose, most Grand Lodges would just reject it, right? Out of hand, they would never recognize its authority. And I mean, there were times in Masonic history where there was a hope that there was something like that. So one of those, there was a guy named Baron von Hund, German guy, and he was worried about the infiltration in many French lodges, in German lodges of what he felt were occult activities that were negative to the religion of the day. And so he formed what's called the Rite of Strict Observance throughout Germany, and it was a hope to return Masonry to its pure form. And he claimed he was being directed by these guys known as the secret superiors, right? And everybody that joined was very excited. Oh, we've got secret superiors. Who are they? These some ancient Templars or something? And well, as the years went by, the secret, the unknown superiors, never manifested. And so the Rite of Strict Observance kind of falls apart. So, I mean, certainly there's always people hoping there's something like that. You even see that with the Rosicrucian movement in the Renaissance, right, where Johann von Andria publishes the Fama Fraternitatis. This document gets circulated that posits there's this group of enlightened men who are chosen by Christ to help the renovation of the world and progress humanity to a new level, right? And so Of course, anyone who joined this group would be sworn to absolute secrecy, so everyone starts to suspect that the great luminaries of their age are Rosicrucians, and of course they deny it, and then the more they deny it, the more their peers begin to think that they are one, right? And so there is a tendency, right, to want to believe that there's a centralizing group that's running things.
Okay.
So there are many examples of this throughout history, but it does not seem to be the case in Freemasonry, though there are all kinds of appendant bodies in Freemasonry. But if you look at those, none of them are ancient, extending back into ancient times. You can often find the date when they were created, and they are creations, modern creations, often an attempt. Masonry is kind of a lodestone, and so especially 19th century Masons began to find all this other fascinating philosophic information, so they create what's known as the Scottish Rite in the United States, known as the Ancient and Accepted Rite in England, and they put on more plays because they have more material they want to represent. And so the story of Enoch becomes very important, right? And this, that guy, there was a guy named James Bruce who was a Freemason, and he discovered the Book of Enoch in Ethiopia and brought it back to England, and it was translated. And it seems this may have had some influence in the formation of what we call the high degrees. And, Enochian stuff is, of course, fascinating. Reading about the pre-flood times.
I was going to say, is that where we think most of that Egyptian religion and knowledge came from? Because you have Sumerians, you have the Mesopotamian, but then you just have this random Egyptian. To me, it seems random because I don't know, where we think it precursed from. But like, it's just this golden nugget of, like you said, for 4,000 years, the hieroglyphs almost didn't change. I mean, they're very sophisticated, they're very educated, they're very, very organized and complex, and in a world that many nations were still very barbaric at that time, right? So it's like, do we know? Is that
well,
where
let me throw an idea out to you, because many Christians have been disturbed when they discover that there are things that date long before Christianity that look really Christian.
Yeah.
Right? So if you see the baby Horus on Isis's lap, it looks a heck of a lot like Mother Mary and Jesus. And
100%.
Many have said, well, hey, isn't Christianity just a reinvention of this cycle? And here's how I view it: if Christianity is true, and I personally believe it is, but if it's true, that means at some point in a very long time ago that there was a man named Adam, and that he shared a Christian story, that someday there would be an intermediary, a representative of God, the Son of God, who would fight against chaos, descend into the underworld, conquer death, and rejuvenate all of man, just like the crops get rejuvenated every year with the winter and summer cycle. And this story would have been shared amongst all the tribes of the earth, and it would have had a natural evolution into almost every pagan religion, right? So when I see ancient Egyptian religion, and I see how Christian many of the elements are, even to the point where breaking bread and eating it was seen as breaking the body of Osiris and consuming it, right?
Very, very.
Well, I mean, what is ancient Christianity posits that the sacrifice of animals was instituted in the very earliest times. And though some people are like, well, hey, that's blood magic, nothing could be more natural. All humans have to kill animals to live.
100%.
So what is the story here? Well, it's interesting, right? The Egyptians seem to get it right on. Have you ever heard of a reversion of offerings before?
I don't think so.
So this is very interesting. So when you sacrifice the animal, so the priests are basically also butchers, right?
Yeah,
so they come in and this is something every day that happens, right?
Yeah.
An animal is rendered into food products, right?
Like whether it's burnt or cut the throat or whatever it is.
You get to a very interesting point. The entire animal is not disposed of. Now, it's true, occasionally offerings, like a fully burnt offering, is made, but most offerings, a part of the animal is offered up. And what the ancient Egyptians would do is the animal is rendered into foodstuffs, right? And it would be presented before the god or the ancestor, and then they would wait. And obviously, the food, not stupid, right? The food, and if you left it there too long, it would rot. That wouldn't be good. So after the god or ancestor had eaten the essence of the food, and in ancient Israel, this would also happen, part of the offering would get burnt up, but the rest of the meat would then be cooked, right?
Okay.
Now, the next part of the ritual happens, and people always forget this when they talk about animal sacrifice. The reversion of the offering would happen. Then the food would be distributed to the priests, and then to the lesser priests, and many times to the common people.
They're sharing the steak of the cow that was just...
What is the principle here? We give something to God, it has to get disassembled, and then it's shared with everybody, and mysteriously, it always seems like there's more than there was, right? So when
true,
Christ feeds the 5,000, right, they bring the small offering to him, sit apart, and then he distributes more than they had received, right? This is a reversion of offerings, right?
Gotcha.
And the Christian sacrament is an example of this. The wine and the bread are ripped apart. So essentially your modern Christian priest is butchering the bread as a symbol of Christ and then distributing. The reversion of the offerings happen. And this is a true principle. It's always true. We all do this. And so you see the Egyptians, ancient Egyptians are doing this, and they have a story about a god who was a good god who was killed, goes to the underworld, organizes the righteous from the wicked, and then another manifestation of that God brings justice to the earth. So we have Christ the Lamb, which is quite like Osiris, and then Christ the Lion at the end of time. Well, that's more like Horus, right? And Osiris is typically white. Well, his robes are, right? So when I see that the Christian story mimics this, so the Egyptians are showing it mythologically, and it's mythologically true, but it doesn't historically happen until the advent of Christ. So I'm not bothered at all by the similarities in ancient religions to Christianity. So that doesn't bother me at all. So so if Christianity is true, then we're just seeing reflections of that story down throughout history. And it's, of course, quite shocking to see how similar that story is in every ancient
in so many
society.
religions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, even many of the Hindi, same concept.
Right. I mean, there's only so many stories you can tell, right? It's just, it seems the story that we have as Christians is the supreme example of this principle, right? And, though modern Christianity does emphasize it, the Orthodox do, the harrowing of hell, when Christ dies, he does not go to heaven immediately, right? Because when he sees Mary, he says, touch me not, I've not yet ascended to my Father. So where was he for 3 days? Well, the harrowing of hell is he went down to the underworld. And you can see there's an early Christian text called the Gospel of Nicodemus that didn't make it into the New Testament. He went to the underworld and he separated the righteous dead from the wicked dead, and then he begins resurrecting them. He starts with Adam, and he works his way up, and they are brought up with him, and he opens the gates of heaven and opens the gates of hell, right? And so that part of the story I don't think is emphasized enough, the underworld journey that even Christ does. But so we find that supreme example.
And that's the thing you were talking about with the sharing of essence between Horus and Osiris.
Oh, you're connecting it. That's right. And if you look at many of these examples of the harrowing of hell, Christ is doing a special handshake to the patriarch. And in others, you will see a special embrace that he's engaging in.
In art pieces, what you're saying?
Yes,
I
many
don't
of
even
them.
think I've seen.
So you will see in ancient Egyptian temples, there's the stela of
I got some
Ka-Hedjet, I believe it is one. I mean, you can see these all over. The pharaoh is embracing the god, and you will see them together, foot to foot, knee to knee, hand to back, mouth to ear.
I have a lot of research to do.
Yes, and you will see this. This is that supreme embrace. You see it in King Tut's tomb. If you look at the back wall of King Tut's tomb, you will see King Tut embracing Osiris. Osiris is dead. Is his little hands coming out, and they are sharing an embrace. So this is that supreme moment, right, where the Christian hopes to become like Christ. And the early Christians had a robust doctrine of theosis, right, where they thought not only you're trying to do what Christ did, but they believe you become like him, right, and assume his essence and his identity. And this is still a doctrine in the Orthodox faith, right, theosis, right? The Western Christians, we've really forgotten about that, but Orthodox Christians and we, Latter-day Saints also have this belief. We believe in theosis, that we will become as like our Creator as is possible to be. We don't believe that we're going to supplant him or replace him or anything like that, but that there's a reason he calls us his children, right? Because we share an essence and we're not his pets, right? A pet has a limit on its development. We believe that if a person is fully accepts Christ and is saved, that their progression will be infinite and they will become as like God as is possible.
Awesome.
It's an intriguing thing.
Tell me this. So I have two questions. Well, let's just go with this one. So we have this the Christian story, how we were just talking about. And I've known this. There's so many similarities when I've traveled to India and I've seen the gigantic temples with like hundreds of ornately carved and colored gods that are there. And we have, like you said, stories of Egypt. There's so many stories from so many religions going back. I mean, Nordic and Viking, Jews, name it, that have very, very, very similar stories. Of course, the flood, the deluge is one of the biggest.
Oh, you see, even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have a flood story.
So many, right? So tell me this with that. So basically what you're positing or what you're saying is that the story that the Egyptians would play out, or this idea of when you have Isis and you have baby Horus and then you have Mary and you have Jesus later, that the act was happening obviously during when Christ was here, but that somewhere before, whether it was Adam had been told this story and then it was handed down, that the Egyptians had been told this and then were just acting it out, knowing that one day it would happen? Or was it, because it almost sounded like you said that they were acting it out. How do I say this? They were acting out or had this story that Isis had this baby Horus as if it had already happened.
Yes.
So, but did they believe it had already happened, or do you think they knew that it was yet to come?
I don't. Yeah, I'm not saying that the Egyptians secretly believed that this was going to happen in the future. They didn't have a view of history like that. They had a more.
So they didn't think it already had happened?
No, they believed it did. It happened in an earlier time, right? You can see these like the Turin king list, right? It's a list of all the official kings on one of the Egyptian temples, and you can see that there was a time they haven't this is when Horus lived. Here's Ra was the first king, and then he had to go to heaven, and then it goes right down from gods to like Horus, then to kind of demigods, and then the actual the guys we would view as historical pharaohs, right? So the ancient Egyptians are acting out an archetypal thing which they believe happened in the remote past, but was always happening again and again. The Egyptians had two words for time, Nehe and Jet, because time has two faces. Just the Egyptians were very, they had merisms, right? You would call a merism is like just defining a thing by its opposite, right? So heaven and hell, up and down, right? The heavens and the earth, right? They called the Nile the two banks, right? Egypt was often referred to as the two kingdoms, right? Upper and Lower Egypt. They really emphasized the bringing of Upper and Lower Egypt together, these two things together that become one thing. Well, time is that way. So Nehe describes cyclical time, a thing that always happens again and again and again, like the year, right? They also have Jet, which is eternal sameness. So there's a linear component to time, and then there's a cyclical component to time. If you combine those two, you get a spiral, right? And we see that's it's more complicated than that, and you really have to dig into their nuances, right? But historical time would be more like Jet, right, where there's a string of events. But in the midst of that, there's all these cycles that happen over and over again, right? And in fact, there are some Egyptian texts that posit the whole cosmos will go through that, right? Book of the Dead, chapter 175. Describes when the whole cosmos returns to the chaos from whence it came. Osiris and Atum will join and all will dissolve again into the undifferentiated chaos from whence it came. But the implication is that a whole new cosmos will be created. Start again. So there's all these little cycles, like there's the day and night cycle, and then there's the year cycle, there's the the moon cycle. So the Egyptians are seeing all these cycles of time. That one text, the Book of Dead 175, indicates that maybe they believe that the whole cosmos itself would have this happen. And, if you look at some of these physicists, they're like, well, maybe that will happen. This universe, it looks like it's going to run out, right? The dark energy is getting pumped into this. The acceleration is going faster and faster. Everything is going to get dissolved. And even now, because of Hawking radiation, the black holes dissolve, giving infinite time, right? So, sounds like we're going to need a new universe, right? And so, so you ask like that. So no, it doesn't seem like they said, hey, one day this is actually going to happen, right? But I will tell you, it's interesting. They mummify their dead. Right? And the dead are waiting. They did not believe mummification is the final end. We have netherworld books that say you will cast off your wrappings, you will dance, so the body's prepared so the Ba can come back to it and the Ka can live there. And because they thought you're made up of parts. And so they envision that this thing is going to revive, but for them, getting resurrected once would not be good enough. You need infinite resurrections. You need the power to...
Because of all the cycles.
Because cycles always... So that's... The Greeks thought this was weird. They're like, the Egyptians, you think your gods died. And they're like, well, yeah, but everything dies. The gods go from manifest to unmanifest. The Greeks thought that was stupid. They're like, God's outside of space and time. The Egyptians are like, no, he's not. He's part of the creation, right? So for them, infinite resurrections is what is needed. So now we fast forward. Here's an interesting thing, though. One of the first converts we read about in the book of Acts is an Ethiopian, right? He's an Egyptian, and he immediately converts. And I believe it was St. Mark, the lion-headed one, goes to Alexandria, and there are mass conversions. The Coptic Christian community was very robust, and it seems there were mass conversions throughout ancient Egypt, and it seems...
Because that spoke to them, that story.
Well, yeah, I personally believe, right, the story of Christ, they're like, hey, about how, like, there's a virgin, and she gave birth to the Son of God, and he grew, and he went to the underworld, did all this stuff, and he resurrected these people, and they now live in heaven. They're like,
yeah, we know that.
That's going on, like, yeah, right now. And I could see,
wow.
I could see an ancient Egyptian person, like, hearing historically that happened. And because remember, their civilization was in decline. They hadn't been ruling themselves for a long time. They were a Roman client state, and that's rough. And the Egyptian temples were struggling to get funding. It's an expensive thing, maintaining an ancient Egyptian temple. I mean, these are cities, right? I mean, you got people, all the stuff that they have to make, the animals, all the food that has to be brought in, the incense that they're making, all of the services they're providing, the embalming stuff, all that stuff, that didn't happen in the temple, but probably in structures around it. I mean, it was hard to maintain all that stuff. And really, you look at like something like Hermeticism or Freemasonry, the question is, how do we make a mystery system portable? How do you make an Egyptian temple portable? How do you make those principles able to be transmitted? Well, we know now, because of the Nag Hammadi find, that there were actually Hermetic brotherhoods. And Hermeticism seems to draw some principles from ancient Egyptian religion. And Freemasonry is like a portable ancient temple. It's a way to kind of portably bring that stuff around, right? Well, we know there's like gates of ancient Solomon's temple, well, it'd be very inconvenient to make that, but we do a symbolic gate. You imagine it, right? Okay. And it seems to fulfill its purpose. So anyway, it's kind of a off topic, but from what you asked. But no, I don't think the Egyptians were just waiting for this prophecy to happen. But when they heard about it happening, it seemed that a lot of them did convert.
Did realize that, holy cow. Because that is a confusing point for me where I'm like, well, if they, like most religions of that time or just of antiquity in general, it sounds like they are repeating stories that they think or believe already happened. And so it's like if, Isis already gave birth to Horus, but then it come in with Jesus. And I can see how when, like you said, around that time when Christ was the actual life was happening and those things were going on, they'd be like, wow, wait, we see a strong parallel. Let's convert. But I wonder about that because it's not just them. There are a lot of ancient religions that have very similar stories that, it makes me wonder, because if you go all the way back and you say Adam had this story handed to him originally, and then it went down and down and down and down and down, it would be easy to mix the timelines of past and present somewhere along those thousands of years, and where Adam's saying this will happen one day, the Egyptian priests say, hey, it already happened. It would be easy to telephone tag, eventually the press, those get flip-flopped. I could see that.
That's right. And I'm a Christian, so I do believe in a literal Adam. I mean, there isn't, documented evidence for this stuff. I'm not saying there is. I know where the evidence ends and where my speculation begins. But for me, that's why it doesn't bother me that there's all these similarities out there. Though some Christians are very bothered by that there are similarities, right? They think that it could diminish or make it look like the Christian story is just fabricated and copied from earlier systems. But I mean, let's there's also the Jordan Peterson explanation, right? Which is as people tell stories, the truest and most profound stories, jockeying for position, percolate to the top, and through an evolutionary survival of the fittest, the best story just wins out. In all of these ancient mythologies, the best story you can come up with is a representative of God comes down, defeats chaos, helps humanity purge itself from its evil impulses, brings the heavens and the underworld together, and we get to go live with the gods for eternity and fulfill our ultimate purpose, because it's, even the Greeks mention this. It's like kind of weird that human beings have as much mental capacity as we do. I mean, we have the lifespan of an animal, but you can like imagine eternity, so you sit around dreading your own life. So like animals don't have to dread their own death. I mean, they have fear and stuff, right? So they have just the right amount of consciousness to seem to enjoy the moments, right?
That's about it,
Humans have the mind of a god, right? Because we can imagine eternity and we go do mathematics and all that stuff, but we have the lifespan of an animal. So man is in the middle, right? So it's very frustrating. So Greek religion was kind of disappointing. They're having like the fields of asphodel, which most people go to. It's this bleak kind of wan half-life. Only in the Greek mystery religion do you really get this hopeful future, like the Orphic or Dionysian mysteries, where they believed you could bypass the well forgetfulness, the river of Lethe, right, and drink from the cup of Mnemosyne, and you would have your eternal memories restored, and you might be able to escape the cycle of rebirth and then go live with the gods, right? Wow. And there's even these little golden tablets called passports of the dead, Totenpass, and the Orphics would use these, and it was like a little golden cliff notes of your ritual that you were initiated in that would help you bypass this. So the Eleusinian mysteries happened near Athens, and it was this mystery system, and that's where the Greeks seemed to get their hope. And these mystery systems were probably modifications of the Egyptian mysteries, right? And that's where the greatest hope for the Greek seeker would come from when they would get initiated into this stuff. Even Marcus Aurelius was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. And ultimately, we really don't know what happened because they actually kept it secret, right? But it had something to do with a reenactment. The Eleusinian mysteries, was a reenactment of Persephone going to the underworld and then coming back, and the cycle of the seasons, and there was this place called the Telesterium. It was this whole ritual initiation house. You can still go to the ruins of this structure, and some kind of ritual happened. We think they had these like shutters that would, the candidates after 3 days forgot that it was daytime and they thought it was night, and they're in the darkness, and then some guy lifts the shutters and this noonday light would reflect down onto them like a pillar, and so it's like you would see the sun at midnight. There's some interesting accounts. That's from Apuleius, the Golden Ass, even though that was his description of his initiation into the mysteries of Isis. Something like that might have been happening in the Eleusinian mysteries. So these things have a tendency to kind of get passed down the generations and modified, right? So we know that that happens. But Freemasonry, I don't think really directly connects to that stuff. I really think it was guys kind of reenacting this stuff, just kind of recreated. And then as they go back and see these things kind of pattern. It's a very, it's a complicated thing, but it's interesting.
That is very curious. Yeah. Yeah. And there are, because it seems to me that most, I don't know, I shouldn't say, so many of the religions, so many of the stories, so many of the current societies, occult societies, esoteric, the mystery schools, draw their inspiration from Egypt. So I always ask myself the question, where did they get it from? Where do we have any idea where it came from before that? Because they were so good at record keeping, but besides maybe some Sumerian, there weren't many people before them that kept that good of records. Right?
Let me tell you a funny story about that. Okay, so we haven't been able to read hieroglyphs that long. Okay, and people have known about the ruins of Egypt for a long time. It was always a feather in your cap if you could connect your system to the most ancient thing, right?
Yeah, for sure. There
was a guy known as Cagliostro. He was known as the Masonic magician, and he comes about in the 1800s, okay? And this guy wants to recreate what he calls true Egyptian masonry. And this is at a time before the hieroglyphs are understood, and so he creates the Egyptian rite of Freemasonry. Many people consider him to be a charlatan now. This was right. He was active right when the War of 1812. Okay, remember, this is right. Napoleon is the guy who actually goes to Egypt and gets all of his architects and draftsmen and everything to go map out Egypt, right? And start Napoleon kind of starts modern day Egyptology, right?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that too. When you said Freemasons had gone down there and everything, if that had
so here's why I bring the story up. So Cagliostro wants to have a true Egyptian. He wants to give you an Egyptian experience, right? He's like, those Masons aren't doing it. Let me give you the real Egyptian secret, right? Well, we actually have the rituals now, at least the first several of them. You can read them now. And I've been through them. And the thing that amuses me about it is they are very not Egyptian at all.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of a blend of Hermetic ritual with an embellishment of angelic magic. He was trying to summon angels and do various things, and a very colorful room, used of incense and stuff, but nothing really that's overtly Egyptian, right? And he couldn't have known that because no one could read the hieroglyphs, right? Intriguingly, when you do actually read about this mystery of Osiris dying in the underworld, Horus going down, communing with him, tokens being exchanged, Horus coming back, gate guardians, words having to be exchanged to go through all that stuff, turns out that's real Egyptian stuff, and that's in basic Freemasonry, Blue Lodge Freemasonry. And so he looked past the mark. He didn't even realize that the basic Blue Lodge he was trying to update and make more Egyptian was already more Egyptian than his Egyptian rite.
Wow.
But we only know that now because you can read
Modern
it, right?
technology.
And read about what they were actually doing back then. So yeah, this is a very old game, trying to attach your system to the most ancient thing because Egypt is obviously successful and people are curious. I mean, if you told me, like, who do you want to meet from history? I want to meet Imhotep, the high priest of Ra, who lived, in the 3rd dynasty and helped build the step pyramid of Saqqara. And I want him to take me through an Egyptian degree and the rituals and all. Wow. I would love to see that. I'm sure he probably wouldn't show me any of it, even if I could meet him,
but
right?
if you could, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, and people would want that badly, right? Yeah. Especially during the Romantic movement in Europe, where people are trying to reconnect to nature and to these ancient pagan religions and to have this, incredible experience. But sadly, this is the real reality. We don't know a lot about what they did. We know some things. Like you'll see modern day Wicca, right? It posits itself to be a recreation of the ancient Celtic spiritual practices. Well, maybe it is, but it can't really trace its lineage back. Yeah. And when you look at it, because we don't really know what they were doing. We barely know what the Druids were doing. We have accounts.
Record keeping.
Just the stuff. Even if they were great record keepers, the records didn't stay around. We don't have them, right? Mm-hmm. So when you look at like Raymond Buckland, who tried to bring this Celtic witchcraft to the United States, and you actually look at what he's doing. Well, it's mostly Hermetic stuff and things you could have learned by reading books that were present, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when a lot of the stuff was basically fabricated. Even the pentagram, right, is a Greek symbol, right? And but groups are always trying. I don't blame them. They're trying to do this to connect themselves to the oldest thing. And the Egyptians were trying to do that. The Zep Tepi, the first time, right? We want to be connected to the dawn when God and man were all together and creation was perfect before it began to degenerate. So I think that's where that instinct comes from. It's a totally reverse way of thinking than the modern, that we started bad and that we're going to perfect as time goes along. The ancients had a kind of a reverse view, that it started perfect and then things
we're just trying to make it not let it go too bad before our time's up.
Yeah.
So we don't really know where Egyptians learned most of their rituals, rites, things like we don't.
Of course,
we don't have we don't have like a record that they said we learned this from this people, like how you were mentioning the Hebrews took that when they escaped Egypt. They kind of took it from the Egyptians. We don't really have much before Egypt, right?
Well, and again, I say that just because the Hebrews never say they took it from them. I can just tell you, I know circumcision is an Egyptian rite that predates when they do it. I can see the tabernacle looks a heck of a lot like an axial temple. Even the fact you put the ark on the rods and carry it around, it's like an Egyptian boat with the rods on it. So there's a lot of similarities there, and I like that. The Egyptians themselves, so the earliest written Egyptian texts we have are the pyramid texts written on Pharaoh Unis's pyramid. He's near the end of the 5th dynasty. So obviously these were on papyrus documents that didn't survive, right? Because they're very complex, and they're not like a modern scriptures where it has, continuity and time. Each one of these are kind of individual. They call them spells. Spells not really a great translation of it. Some of them describe the offerings that will be made. Some of them describe little allusions to mythological precedent. Okay. Others promise him things. When you go through and you can look at it, and none of it refers to something older, but it obviously came from something earlier, right? And how far back does this stuff go? Well, again, that's kind of where that's where the trail goes cold.
Egypt is where, which is what was my understanding. I just didn't know if you had maybe heard or read it.
It's about as far back as you can go with. I mean, the Epic of Gilgamesh is in the ringer. I mean, the pyramid texts are 2,500 BC. I know the Vedas are supposed to be around that old. And again, that's about as far back as you can go, man, we know that they were doing things long before the 5th dynasty. And we have things that they left, like the Narmer palette, right, from Hierakonpolis. But it has, some small hieroglyphs on it and some mythological scenes. And, it shows the pharaoh of that time conquering the northerners, which is Lower Egypt. But it's not enough to really reason out all this stuff. Colleen Darnell and John Darnell, they're incredible Egyptologists, and they spend time looking at these rock engravings on a lot of the trade roads and oasis roads around ancient Egypt, and they've found some really old stuff, right? But again, they're typically pictorial, and again, it's about as early as you can go, and then you get into the realm of pure speculation.
Yeah, that's a fun.
And we just got to be honest when we're speculating and when we're not. That's one of the things I like about robust research into the esoteric there's a guy, Justin Sledge, an amazing esoteric scholar, and I love the guy because he's so precise. He's like, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. Here's where you can have fun speculating here. Here is as far as we can go with the information that we have.
So far.
And that would really help out a lot, because a lot of the speculation gets superimposed as fact, and it damages these fields.
Yeah.
And frankly, the facts are oftentimes more interesting to me than the speculations.
What do you think of this? I heard recently that there was I don't know if it was already out or someone was developing it or whatever, but an AI that could read the hieroglyphs and decipher them more effectively than humans could.
I mean,
I wonder if that's really cool or if it's really dangerous, because it could give us the wrong answer and then we believe the wrong thing.
You're going to have to verify it with an Egyptologist, right? Who spends a lot of time doing this. And, they all argue amongst each other about how these things should be translated and
that's
the
the
nuances.
hard part,
And it's all comparative stuff, right? They take all these documents and they read it for a long time. And, even then we're always going to be seeing through a filter, right? The filter of our own perception. We have a shared humanity with the ancient Egyptians, but they viewed the world very differently than we do. And it's always important to recognize that, right? Because it's very easy to superimpose your beliefs on them. For years, people would argue that, the ancient Egyptians were monotheists, and some people, no, they're polytheists. Turns out neither was true. Eric Hornung, an incredible Egyptologist, German guy, said, well, they're not either of those. They're henotheists.
What is that? I've never.
A henotheist is a society that recognizes many gods, but emphasizes a supreme God based on the region you're in. So just like there's many dads in the world, and you recognize there's many dads, when you're in your own house with your dad, he's preeminent. If you visit a neighbor and his dad's there, that dad has, your dad's still important, but that dad's really important too.
In that house, yeah.
So the ancient Egyptians, all of them revere Ra, but Ra's kind of distant. In every local temple, the local god takes on a creator role, as if he were the creator god. So if you're in Elephantine, Khnum is the creator god. If you're in Sayas, Neith is the creator goddess. If you're in Memphis, Ptah is the creator god. If you're in Hermopolis, Thoth is the creator god. And if you're in Edfu, Horus is the creator god. But they also recognize that Ra is the creator god. So
the overarching.
It's a syncretic religion. They accept that all gods are probably real, but location creates a certain preeminence. You can think about it like a beautiful fractal pattern where you see these patterns, recreating themselves all over ancient Egypt, and yet they have this kind of national character. So they recognize a local god. If you're there in that area, he has preeminence. But Ra is always still important.
So this is not far off from like the Greeks and Romans, where you'd have a temple of Apollo here, and you'd have a temple of Aphrodite over there. But really, Zeus was kind of over. Is it similar to that?
Yeah, probably more so in ancient Egypt, right, than the polytheisms of Greece. But I will say, and Jan Assmann, probably one of the most famous Egyptologists, he died not too long ago. He emphasized that the Egyptian religion could talk to other polytheistic religions pretty well. And you know that because they would superimpose names over each other. So when the Greeks showed up, they just renamed all the gods, and they often commented, this god seems to have this portfolio, and this god seems to have that portfolio. Hardcore monotheistic religions are the ones that have a lot of trouble talking to versions of polytheism, right? But yeah, Egyptians are henotheistic, and that's an example of, many modern authors just kind of superimposed our beliefs on it.
Interesting.
And it's easy to do. It's always easy to do.
Yeah, it is frustrating, because if that's as far back as we can go, really, Egypt, it is hard to have 5 different scientists or Egyptologists interpret the same wall of, it's the same thing Protestants do with the Bible, but to interpret the same wall and get different answers and kind of try and figure out. Because I don't know. I think it's fascinating. I think that
it's very interesting stuff.
We can understand so much of why people do what they do today if we can understand why they believe what they believe, and so much of why people believe what they believe nowadays is just their location, their environment, the country they were raised in, or the family, if you can trace the religion they believe in back a little bit farther. So I've always been very interested in finding the origins of as much as possible, but the farther back we go, it gets murky,
Yeah, there's that element as well, and then there's kind of the mystic path, right? Try to communicate with the divine and receive confirming feelings. And for me, that's also a very important part of my life. All of this stuff is interesting, and I love people digging around in the dirt to see what happened a long time ago. But also functionally in my life, prayer, fasting, meditation, all these things have had profound influences on me as well. and have convinced me that God is real and that the divine exists and that he's not a passive being and interacts in our lives. And the more we pursue that communication, the more open it gets. It's one thing that amazed me about the Brazilians. Those people have so much faith. They see visions. They have just incredible stuff. We in the West have become very skeptical of beliefs. Kind of, we encountered all of these different beliefs, so it was hard to believe in any one thing. You're like, well, if I was just in ancient Egyptian, I'd believe that. Or if I was born in Iraq, I'd be a Muslim. It starts to seem arbitrary. It makes the truth seem arbitrary. And that's kind of something that we've really struggled with in the West, is the arbitrariness of the thrownness of life. Like Heidegger talked about, we're just thrown into life. You don't choose your parents, the age you're born in, your race, your gender, your sex. This is a huge outrage for the progressive movement, because everything's based on consent, right? You consent to almost nothing, right?
Exactly.
So it's very unfair.
Yeah.
And you're thrown into life, and it just seems arbitrary, right? But if there's one thing I appreciate about Freemasonry and the ancient Egyptians, it's the belief that truth is objective, real, eternal, discoverable, and external and independent of human opinion. And that's perhaps one of the most important principles. The Egyptians had that. They called it ma'at, the principle of transcendent truth and order, and even the gods lived off it, and it was eternal. The gods, essentially, the Egyptian priests sometimes would threaten God if he didn't fulfill his promises. This was confusing to other priests. Like, you're threatening God, because if God does not fulfill his promises, he has lied. And if he is not living according to Ma'at, chaos will destroy it all. The ancient Egyptians believed that chaos was ever present and ready to swallow reality again. They weren't angry at God because things were bad. They were amazed that anything could be good at all. And without constant effort, everything would just crumble and fall apart. And if there's one thing modern people have, I think many of them have forgotten, is that chaos is always here, always ready to overtake everything that we have. And without a constant search for the truth, I hate the term "my truth." This is just outrage to me. There is a truth, and then there is our attempt to apprehend it, right? And that's a principle, I think, that if you can't agree that there is an objective truth, we will just revert to tribes and then fight for power again.
It is true. I like that chaos. It is the destructive route I believe is always the easy route. If you don't want to be in good physical shape, all you have to do is not go to the gym and not watch your diet, and by default you will you'll gain weight or gain gray hairs, wrinkles, whatever you want. I mean, the easy route is always the more destructive route. Like I said, I believe I've never heard it described in that way, philosophically or religiously, where you have this idea of this God always trying to bring light into the darkness or the chaos, because as soon as he stops, the default is going to, but it makes sense when you think of it that way, exactly is the default, or the easy route is the destructive and the chaotic route. Thanks so much,
my pleasure.
Dr. Harvey. Is there anything?
You can call me Joseph.
Joseph. Are there any ways that you want to have anybody that's maybe listening or watching this to be able to reach out to you, contact you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, email is basically what I use right now, joseph.harvey@gmail.com, josef.harvey@gmail.com. I'd love to talk to people about this stuff. I try to avoid the social media as much as possible. And I wouldn't be opposed to answering any questions people had, or pointing them in directions towards things they're interested in learning more about.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Learned a lot about the Egyptian religion and history and Freemasonry and everything in between. So appreciate having you on, and maybe we'll have time to do another one.
Yeah, love to.
So thank you.
All right, take care, man.